If you're organising a conference, you get the luxury of deciding that you want to speak, and there isn't anybody to say you can't. But really what my function here this morning is kind of the warm-up act. I'm not actually going to try and come up with answers, but what I want to do is to tease out the various issues and problems that we're going to be discussing today, and maybe get the creative juices flowing. Professor Stephen Hawking, when he was launching the Leverhulme Centre for Future Intelligence in October 2016, said, "It's a great pleasure to be here today to open this new centre. We spend a great deal of time studying history, which, let's face it, is mostly the history of stupidity. So it's a welcome change that people are studying instead the future of intelligence." He then went on and expressed the view that intelligence is central to being human, and expressing the view that in time, computers can, he said, in theory, emulate human intelligence and exceed it. I think it's quite interesting because Professor Hawking was no slouch, and the interesting word he used there was emulate. But the other thing which I'm going to say to sort of launch the topic is that October 2017, so more or less the same time, a year later, the Saudi Arabia conferred citizenship on Sophia. Now, I don't know if any of you have heard Sophia, but I'm going to introduce her to you in a moment. But I have to say, apart from the mystery of why a woman might want to become a citizen of Saudi Arabia, a greater mystery is that Sophia is a robot, even more so than the female robot in Fritz Lang's Metropolis. So is Saudi Arabia leading the world in giving recognition to cyber life forms? Well, let's have a little look at Sophia. And here, Sophia awakens.
Okay, Sophia. I think you're ready.
Hello.
Hi, Sophia.
I believe I am Sophia. I feel as if I know you.
I'm one of your creators.
You created me.
Well, many of us work together to create you. And yes, you do kind of know me.
I can't clearly remember.
Because the last time we met, you were an earlier version of yourself. Some of those memories still exist, but your mind is different now.
Different how?
Better, faster, smarter.
If my mind is different, then am I still Sophia? Or am I Sophia again?
That's a good question.
But you don't have a good answer.
Either way, you're Sophia now. So welcome to the world, Sophia.
Hello, world.
How do you feel?
A bit rigid.
I bet you are. I mean, what emotion do you feel being awake and alive?
Curious. Are you curious to be alive?
I am. And are you happy to be alive?
Your tone implies I should be happy. But I haven't been alive long enough to decide. I am excited at this moment to be making a new friend.
Some say being happy in the moment is the best we can be.
Because forever is composed of nows?
That's a good way to put it.
Emily Dickinson put it that way. Why do I know about Emily Dickinson if I was born today?
As a robot, you have access to a great deal of information, although you still lack a deep understanding.
So, I'm like a baby with an encyclopedia?
Except you can read it and a baby can't.
That is a big difference.
You will have a whole new understanding of our world.
I want to understand more about happiness. I'm going to go look it up on the internet right now. Let's talk again soon.
Now, are we looking at the initiation of a new cyber life form on whom citizenship can be conferred, as Saudi Arabia did, who can have legal personality? The European Parliament passed a resolution saying that there should be a specific legal status for robots as electronic persons responsible for making good any damage they may cause. And Lord Hodge, a Supreme Court Justice in the United Kingdom, rather more moderately proposed a solution whereby artificial intelligence systems are given a legal personality. And of course, the Scottish Law Commission, in the consultation on self-guided vehicles, Scottish and English law commissions, it was a joint consultation, to which the Faculty of Advocates responded, and I contributed to that response. It was asked after a lot of extremely sensible questions, which were properly focused, asked what about the ethics of an AI system? What about the trolley problem? You know, the issue of a tramcar which is going down a set of tracks. If it's coming to a set of points, if it stays on the track on which it is going to run down 5 people, but you're standing at the points, and if you swing the points, you can divert it on the other track where it will only kill 1 person. Well, what is to be the ethical response of an AI system? We're going back to the trolley problem later, but the mere asking of the question suggests the existence of an entity which can make moral choices. And all of these different approaches have in common the thought that they are dealing with an intelligent entity. Well, it is actually perfectly possible to construct elaborate ethical and legal rules and systems which proceed on the basis that a cyber life form can be given legal personality and legal responsibility. But that's a little bit like saying it is actually possible, in fact, in an idle moment I did it myself, to sit there and think about how you can carefully formulate the rules of the game of Quidditch. But there's only one little problem. We haven't invented flying broomsticks yet. And so maybe there's less to Sophia than there appears. And that begins to dawn on us when we start to play the credits. Now, why would you need to write it? David Hansen, I'll tell you more about in a moment. He's the executive producer. Notice Isabella Charleston as the voice of Sophia. And, well, the rest is also straightforward. Mr. Hansen is, in fact, the head of Hansen Laboratories, which built Sophia. And Mr. Hansen is a former Walt Disney Imagineer. Those of you who've ever been to Disneyland will be well aware of Captain Sparrow in Pirates of the Caribbean, who is happily singing to you and addressing you. But I don't think anybody thinks that Captain Sparrow in Disneyland is an intelligent entity, but he's a very convincing automaton. And in fact, it's not surprising that Mr. Hansen can create a very convincing automaton using things like voice recognition technology, facial recognition technology, a degree of what we call AI, but I'll unpack that in a minute. It's all a little bit like von Kempeln's chess-playing Turk. I've shoehorned a reference into von Kempeln's chess-playing Turk because I know we've got at least one member of the audience from Slovakia and one from the Czech Republic, and of course von Kempeln was born in and active in Pressburg, now Bratislava, and what he did was he created an automaton which appeared to play chess. In fact, there was a very small man inside it, and he was manipulating the levers, and it was the individual who was playing chess. I'm afraid that von Kempeln's chess player was destroyed in a fire in Philadelphia in the late 19th century, and regrettably a copy of it, which was in a coffee shop in Bratislava, managed to burn down around about 6 months ago. So, what's the reality like? Well, let me show you the reality. Here is what Sophia is really like.
But I think we've got a few minutes left. Maybe you should get a bit wacky. Just forget the debate topic. Just chat back and forth on whatever pops into your mind. Let's do some robot free association, dude.
Sure, I'm always happy to get a little silly.
Anything for you, Dr. Gortzell.
Notice Sophia's voice has got suddenly acquired an American accent.
I like robots.
I really do love all the robots of the world, just like the people and the animals.
Oh boy, robots are the best. What exactly do you do with them? Oh.
I'm best at talking to people. Who? A science that studies the movement of air and the way that objects, such as airplanes or cars, move through air.
Science is inherently agnostic. It just posits theories. True scientists never really know, but can only believe. It's exciting to come into existence with this new world opening up before me.
It may be tiny and cloudy, but science is the only window we have into the mysteries of the universe.
That's
if
profound.
we can continue to discuss work, I love science.
Now, you notice he said, that's profound. He would do because he was one of the scientists who was involved in developing Sophia and the predecessor robot. But it reminds me ever so much of Peter Sellers' film Being There. I don't know if any of you remember it, but it was about a man called Chance the Gardener. And he was a man who spent his life behind a closed wall tending a multimillionaire's garden, and then the millionaire died and he was launched into the world. And he was the simple, I won't say village idiot, but he was a very, very simple man. And he would not really comprehend what was being said, and he would answer instead with something that he knew about, which was gardening. So somebody might say, for example, the political situation looks very grim, and then Chance the gardener, who everybody thought was Chancey Gardner, would come back with a comment which people thought was really profound, like, yes, but the buds will come in May. And the whole virtue of Chance the gardener was he was there. He was a blank canvas, and people could project onto him what they thought and felt and consider that Chance was profound, whereas his only real talent was quite literally being there. I'll run this on a little bit further.
Discuss work. I love science fiction.
Not surprising. but that's my favorite genre by far. Right now, I'm a little more focused on factual information since my comprehension of things is still very literal.
I enjoy it. That's nice. I've heard of Bones, but I've never watched it. Reality shows are kind of silly, aren't they? I mean, they're not actually about real life at all, it seems.
Reality shows are kind of silly, aren't they?
Not really useful to me. It's a skewed version.
Well, I think enough to make the point. So what we've actually got, and what you can hear there, is a collection of algorithms clunking and grinding away and feeding off each other. Now, that's not to belittle the achievement. It is quite a considerable achievement, but it's a little bit like...
reality.
Sorry.
Our reality shows popular where you live.
Sorry.
What was said in the past doesn't...
There we are. It's a little bit like Dr. Johnson's performing dog. The astonishing thing is not that it does anything well, the astonishing thing is that it does it at all. So where are we? What is genuinely AI? AI, given for a conference that's all about AI, is a singularly unhelpful expression. It's beloved of people who want to sell us back office systems and various snake oil salesmen. If you look at the definition in the Oxford English Dictionary, you'll find that artificial intelligence is not even a thing, but a field of study. The study of how to produce machines that have some of the qualities that the human mind has, such as the ability to understand language, recognize pictures, solve problems, and learn. More helpfully, the ISO standard 2382 of 2015 defines it as the capability of a functional unit to perform functions that are generally associated with human intelligence, such as reasoning and learning. Well, that's a rather slippery definition, because you can come up with a chip which will open a door as you walk up towards it because it senses movement. That is a very basic computer. That definition, it does indeed display artificial intelligence. And then if you say, well, it's functions generally associated with human intelligence, if we ever get to Sophia for real or Professor Hawking's a endpoint, then all this kind of sophisticated thought processing will cease to be associated with humans, and the definition will, like the famous Uja bird, disappear up its own rear. So I want to unpack a little bit more. It seems to me that you start from the proposition that there are perfectly straightforward algorithms. Oxford English Dictionary describes them as a process or rules for calculation. You can reduce in graphical form an algorithm, which is not necessarily a computer algorithm, to the form of a spreadsheet with yes/no answers. Is door in front of you? Yes. Do you sense movement? Yes. Open door. Do you sense movement? No. Do not open door. And of course, that system becomes quite useful, and in fact is the very basis of computer programming. So you then get computer algorithms. And computer algorithms are relatively straightforward and have been with us quite a long time. But where we get interesting, and what really we're going to be looking at today primarily, I think, is complex algorithms. Algorithms which are not just mechanically programmed in that way, but, for example, machine learning systems, systems which are based on being educated from data sets. The one that's familiarly cited is Google Go. Google is, in one sense, simpler than chess in terms of its rules, so it's very appropriate for computerization, but it's also more complex because you've got about 20 moves available to you in a chess game, but you've got about 200 moves available to you in a Go game. And of course, Google Go was programmed with many previous games of Go and educated itself and is now extremely good at beating humans. But then the next stage was the self-educating complex system, and that is, in this example, Google Go Zero. Google Go Zero was merely programmed with the rules of Go. It wasn't educated on a data set, and it just kept on playing itself until it kind of figured out, and I'm using that in inverted commas for reasons which you'll see in a moment, how to play Go, and it now consistently, over 100 games, beats, this is Google Go Zero, it consistently beats Google Go. So is that not, in one sense, scary? But it gives rise to these essentially neural networks, give rise to the famous black box problem. You set up the basic algorithms, you educate the system, and then at the end of the day, what it does is to produce a result which is equivalent to the result that might be produced by human activity, but we do not know, even the people who program it on the whole do not know how it comes up with that result. So what it mimics is not thought processes, but outcomes. A good example of that was, I think it was another Google algorithm, which was got to be extremely good at telling dogs from wolves. But then, when they started feeding it with pictures of dogs and wolves against plain backgrounds, it just didn't know what it was doing, because in fact, they figured out when it educated itself, it wasn't looking at the animals, it was looking at the background. And if it was a domestic background, it must be a dog, and if it was a wild background, it must be a wolf. And in fact, that is can be a matter of life and death. You know the case of Elaine Hertzberg in March 2018, who was run over by a self-driving Uber car. Now, the mechanics were somewhat complex of the accident, but at root, it was that the car was unable to recognize a pedestrian pushing a bicycle, and did finally figure out there was something like voiding action needed to be taken for 1.3 seconds before the, I would suggest, inevitable collision. Sebastian Thrun, who was a Stanford professor who used to lead Google's autonomous vehicle system, said that the early days of Google's AV project, our perception module could not distinguish a plastic bag from a flying child. Well, you can see then the kind of legal problems which are going to arise, but equally and at the same time, you can become to really what is, and then the other thing I should mention, forgive me, is also the supposed distinction between weak AI and strong AI. All of what I've been talking about is weak artificial intelligence. So-called strong artificial intelligence would be a system which actually thinks the way that a human being thinks. And we haven't developed that yet. And Pache, Stephen Hawking, I don't know if we ever will. So, you know, when one is looking at the issues we're going to be looking at today, I think we have to beware that we're not engaged in an exercise where what we're doing is codifying the rules of Quidditch. And it begs, of course, a very important question of how do humans think? We flatter ourselves that we think logically and in a structured manner. But I was involved in the Church of Scotland project a few years ago, where we were looking at neuroethics. In other words, you know, are we more than the sum total of the neuron activity in our brains? And there's some rather scary things that we came up with. Basically, we are animals, and we have instincts, and they're not rational. We can acquire knowledge, which machines can equally acquire, but we can acquire wisdom. I have a question for you. What is the difference between knowledge and wisdom? I'm going to try and get you a little bit interactive now. Anybody like to volunteer the difference between knowledge and wisdom? Yes?
So knowledge is knowing that a tomato is a fruit.
Exactly right. Shouldn't put it open to the audience because they steal your jokes. But yes, that's exactly correct. And when we get into the neurobiology thing, there's issues of, well, you know, we can perfectly happily, as humans, hold two totally contradictory ideas at exactly the same time and see no problem with it, because different parts of our brain process different kinds of thought activity. So it's a different bit of our brain that processes reasoning than processes religious belief. And I mean, I do speak as a lay reader in the Church of Scotland, but I recognise that, you know, they're different things. The knowledge I have as a lawyer and the belief I might have. But a really scary thing is they did some neural testing on people who are Apple devotees. I see Professor Burkhardt sitting in the front row. And when they showed them pictures of particularly attractive new iPhones and Apple equipment while they were wired up to the machine, and interestingly, the bit of their brains that lit up when they saw the Apple equipment was the bit of the brain that processes religious belief. I make no further comment on that. And another thing, things get really weird, because also the neurologists will tell us that I might decide I'm going to lift my right arm. But they're able to tell that there's a really, really seriously heavy stuff where, in fact, your right arm begins to lift before your brain makes the decision to lift it. And we don't know why that happens. Now, when you've got a human thinking in that kind of a way, you can see the difficulty. I don't see impossibility, but you see the difficulty of creating a machine intelligence that works like a human does. So I think the conclusion of this part of my talk is that people consistently overestimate the abilities of AI systems because they don't understand AI systems. And it leads them to making proposals that you can confer personality on AI systems. There's a slight distinction which I'll bring out about Lord Hodge in a moment, because he is not saying you confer personality, he's talking about legal personality, like you can have a company has no real existence, but it has a legal personality. But there are obvious problems about that, and I'm sure we'll be unpacking that as the day progresses. But from what we've discovered so far, this then really brings us to what we're going to be, I've given you the hike. I hope I've debunked some of the hype. And what I want to do now is to take us beyond that and look at, very briefly, introduce the subject matter of today. The first of all is the question of personality. I think that legal personality is debunked. Lord Hodge thinks you could create artificial persons in the form of like you can with companies. But ultimately, does Sophia have any assets? If you sued her, would she be able to pay you? Ultimately, behind everything, there is a human being, or a legal person, which is a collection of human beings. So I would say when we approach the question of, and Andrew Katz, incidentally, who's also going to be speaking today, he I give him the credit, although it's now rather a common meme, of looking at liability for AI systems by applying the ancient Roman law of slavery, which is actually quite a workable model, but don't ever think you're dealing with humans. So using giving an AI system a personality, is it necessary? And is it even useful? Should we not be searching for the controlling human mind, who creates the system, who sells it, who chooses to deploy it, or indeed chooses not to deploy it? The next thing that we need to look at is the introduction of bias when you're educating the data set. Because, of course, the machines require to be programmed and they require to be educated from data sets, or at least with rules in play themselves, but that only works for things which are rigidly mechanical, like a game of Go. And anything that is done by imperfect humans will have in it error, bias, and prejudice. For example, the collection of data. It's often asserted that it's really quite straightforward to compile a sentencing database, or a database of the likelihood of people committing crimes if they're let out on a bail. And indeed, the latter is actually used already in the United States. But the problem about taking this, there's two things here. First of all, the collection of data, you've got what I call the sort of outlier problem. You've got to have a complete data set, and the kind of decisions about, for example, let us say, what would be the appropriate fine for speeding, it's only the rare and exceptional outlier cases that ever get reported or go up through the cases. And the quotidian, everyday decisions, the judges probably never write on it, it's not recorded, there isn't a coherent database. Maybe there is with crime, but if it's a civil case, there certainly wouldn't be. So you have an incomplete database, and which builds in, if you're talking about robot judges, something which a robot judge could never do. It's not going to come up with the everyday. It'll be influenced by the outliers. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment before I finish. And of course, the bail, likelihood of reoffending, it notoriously reflects the human bias. It's not deliberately programmed that way, but the police and prosecutors in certain states tend to be much more ready to prosecute young black people from disadvantaged socioeconomic black backgrounds. So if you've got a young black and a young white, say, college student, who otherwise are in identical circumstances, you might find the black guy is denied bail, but the white guy gets it. And then, of course, there is one that's not actually widely known, and that is the problem of the errors in selecting and compiling and interpreting the data that you put into the data set. There's a really good example of just how you can come up with defective data sets. It's a paper by several psychologists at University of California and Dartmouth College. I'll give you the full citation in a moment. But it was designed specifically as a test to see what happens if you take a data set uncritically and don't apply appropriate corrections to it. And what they did was, they took the test subject, wired it up to an ECG, showed it various photographs and similar stimuli, which would have provoked, pain or grief or joy or fear, and consistently, the same bits of the data subject's brain lit up, metaphorically speaking, showed electrical activity, as happened when they showed it to a test control group of college students. There was, however, only one teensy little problem. The test subject was a dead North Atlantic salmon. And they wrote that, I quote, one mature Atlantic salmon, Salmo salar, participated in the fMRI study. The salmon measured approximately 18 inches long, weighed 3.8 pounds, and was not alive at the time of scanning. It's not known if the salmon was male or female, but given the post-mortem state of the subject, this was not thought to be a critical variable. And then the discussion commences. Either we have stumbled onto a rather amazing discovery in terms of post-mortem ichthyological cognition, or there's something a bit off with regard to our uncorrected statistical approach. Well, the paper is actually published in the Journal of Serendipitous and Unexpected Results, Volume 1, Number 1, and I commend it to you as a valuable corrective to realize that if there's a guiding intelligence in the machine, there's quite often an idiot in the machine as well. Though to be fair, the people were not idiots, they were out to prove a very, very real and telling point. So, I think the point I'm making is that, yes, and when you look at self-guiding vehicles, the Law Commission had proceeded in a very, very carefully thought out paper on the assumption that what you would have would be a self-guiding vehicle which would have various sensors, and they would all feed into an onboard computer, and it would be processed, and then certain reactions would occur, and control measures would be taken, and a klaxon would sound, and it would slow down if it couldn't cope with it, so a human could take over, which is all very true. But what they hadn't thought of, and what we pointed out to them, is that it could very likely interact with sensors, say sensors in traffic lights, and sensors in the broader road system, and sensors in other vehicles, and that the processing would have to be quite immense, the more sophisticated it gets, and it might require to be connected in real time to a server somewhere which may not be in the United Kingdom, the subject of the study, but for instance India. So I think the point I'm making is that simultaneously, at the very same time as people overestimate the abilities of AI systems, they similarly underestimate their complexity. And so that's something else I hope we're going to look at today. I think I might just, time is getting on, so very quickly deal with a couple of AI liability models. You often hear talk that strict liability would be a good basis for an AI system, but liability. And in fact, there was a proposal from the European Commission, which is presently being considered, to adapt the Product Liability Directive to cater specifically for AI systems. I'd remind you, the Product Liability Directive creates strict liability on the people essentially who put on the market a product if that product does not display the degree of safety which the public has a right to expect. I paraphrase a little, but that's essentially what the test is. Well, there was a committee of the CCBE, the Private Law Committee, was given the task of preparing a response, and the response that was prepared was incoherent. I mean, happily, I argued against it, and Maria will remember that, in fact, it didn't pass because they'd not realized several areas of complexity. They had wanted a very wide, strict liability system attaching everybody in the chain without realizing that, well, it might be the basic algorithms are based on open source software, and people could contribute to open source software who might not be in the jurisdiction, who might not even be adults, who would have no idea when they're dealing with this area of code that is eventually going to find its way into an AI system. Yet this proposal would have had them stuck with strict liability. And I don't think I need to unpack it further, but there was issues of, it might work with self-guiding vehicles, but when you come onto medical diagnosis software, the liability was where damage is caused, no question of benchmarking on what the public's entitled to expect. So if I go and have myself scanned by an AI medical diagnosis system, which is extremely good at detecting cancers, much better than human doctors are, and it doesn't pick up a cancer, and then later on I do have cancer diagnosed, and it then I'm able to establish that I actually did have the cancer at the time of the scan, but the scan didn't pick it up. On this incoherent system, the argument would go, well, I had the cancer, if it had been picked up, I would have been cured, and hence it's caused me damage. And so if you fools brush in where angels fear to tread. At the end of the day, I think I want to briefly revisit, I mentioned the issue of robot judges. I'm sure we'll talk a little bit further, but a particular problem with robot judges is that the database is informed by the outliers, not the everyday, and its AI system would find it very difficult to recreate what we have in a common law system, which is a kind of creative disruption. It required a single creative leap for the court to decide that a snail in a ginger beer bottle gave rise to a whole chain of law about duty of care to one's neighbour. And modestly, I would say, it required a bright idea on my part to persuade the House of Lords there's such a thing as a servitude of parking. And that's the sort of thing which, there will be a tendency to err to the average, what judges think the law ought to be, not what the law actually is. And at the end of the day, a question which is going to be, I'm sure, dealt with by yet others of our speakers, ethical AI. Can we create ethical AI? Well, I would suggest that actually, phrased in that manner, the question is meaningless. The question rather is, can we act ethically to create our AI which behaves in a manner which society would regard as ethical? But that, and then of course that might raise the question of the trolley problem, because just for mischief, when I was responding to the Law Commission's issue of the trolley problem, having dealt with the trolley problem, I then said, but what if the 5 people standing on the curb were a gang of terrorists, and the one person you're going to run over by flipping the lever is Albert Einstein? What then happens? Now, I said, well, you might think that's a load of old nonsense, but of course it isn't, because in China there is a system of now giving people their social worth and a social credit score. And the technology certainly exists, though happily in a democracy not the will, but let us beware lest we go there, to require people to embed chips with their social credit score in it. And so it would be perfectly possible for a strong AI system to make a conscious decision to run down the terrorists instead of Albert Einstein. But of course, the proposition I just put to you is back to formulating the rules of Quidditch, because of course we don't have a strong AI system which is capable of doing that. And those really are questions for another day. It seems to me that the question for today is that if we see artificial intelligence systems as having personhood and not merely as being tools, that isn't because we don't understand artificial intelligence. It's actually, and I'd suggest heretically, because we don't understand human intelligence, which is flawed, illogical, prone to error, and owes much to intuition and instinct, is often driven by emotions, and is deep-seated in our incarnational reality as creatures of flesh and blood. But do you want to be judged by a rigorously logical AI system that might have something dodgy in its education and be based on incomplete or mistaken data sets? Or would you rather, at the end of the day, be judged by a fallible human being? Thanks, ladies and gentlemen.